Yes.
All right, good. Okay. Let's see, got it. Let's get that out of the way. Okay, so healing the trauma of our past. How do we do that? How do we do that? And so how adverse childhood experiences impacts BTM members. How about that, huh? So we're going to take a look at those of you who were kind enough to share your ACE findings with us. We're going to go over those, see how they compare to national averages, and then begin talking about trauma and some of the things that we can do on a journey of healing. And we'll see how far we get. And we may, certainly intersperse questions and comments, and at the end, if not in between, we'll have plenty of time for comments, feedback, questions, all of that. Okay, so let's jump on in. All right, so the first question was around emotional abuse. Have you been talked to in negative ways, communicated negative messages about your value and about your worth? The national average is about a third of men and women answered yes. But look at us. Look at BTM. Over half, 54.5% of you said that you experienced that, okay? Physical abuse, okay? 17.5%. 50% of you, okay? Now, let's just stop right there for a moment with those two, emotional abuse and physical abuse, okay? What messages do you think that those kinds of abuse convey about you, about your emotions, about your emotional self, your feeling self, and about your body, your physical self, okay? So, and then I want to go on to one more, which is sexual abuse, which also has to do with your body, right? A little over 11% of people across the country say that they have experienced sexual abuse. But look at this, 38.6%, over 3 times the national average. So again, let's just take a moment. Speak to us. What do these findings say about how your bodies are cared for or not cared for, how they're used or not used, as well as your emotional and feeling selves? Anyone have any questions or comments about that? Because aren't these I would say not amazing findings, but findings that really hurt. It's like, oh no.
I would say troublesome
findings. Yes. Questions, comments before we move on?
I have one. I think it's kind of disturbing how, we have these findings and we have this type of data. However, there aren't laws, or they're not strict enough laws, as well as they're not being enforced well enough to protect our bodies. And I would like to see something placed in schools where children are taught how to protect their bodies, whether it's emotional, mental, physical, or whatever the case may be.
I would agree.
But I also think it would be important, not even so much in schools, but I think even in church, because as you can imagine, there is this level of denial about the problem being in our midst. And when it does rear its ugly head, the corporate shame, the cultural shame around it being in our midst would hinder our willingness oftentimes to even report it or share it. And to me, that is even more concerning, that we would, it is in our midst and we don't quite know what to do with it.
And even prior to that, our parenting, our parents and how our parents are taught to parent even before we get into the church environment.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, I think that, that's something that, and honestly, you all, listen to me, you all, have been raised in the Caribbean culture, most of you, not everyone, but most of you. And can you be agents of change in your own families? Can you be agents of change where you can make a difference in the way you raise your own children, in the way you connect in your own marriage. So those are questions that we would like to challenge you with.
But I would even say this, that unless you're willing to own the truth of your story, you're doomed to repeat it. And so there needs to be some awareness and some understanding that these experiences have had an adverse effect on your life. And you have to own that so you can no longer pass that legacy on.
Yes. So the next two have to do with not abuse, but neglect. Okay. And the first one has to do with emotional neglect. In other words, your parents might have been physically there, but they weren't emotionally available to you. You know, they weren't connecting with your feelings and all of that. So emotional neglect, national average 14.8, but 47.7. But physical, this is so interesting. Physical neglect, look at that, national average about 10%, but only less than 1%, a half of 1% of you reported physical neglect. That's so striking to me because here your needs for food, clothing, shelter are met, but not your emotional needs.
But I think that probably fits in the picture pretty well because we like to look good. And so if you come to church or you are seen in public and you look shabby or you look like you're not cared for, that would be a reflection on parents. And so because it is a reflection on parents, they would not want that to happen. And so I could see why that would be, that would be negligent compared to other experiences.
Yeah. And then, the next one is, have your parents ever been separated or divorced? 28% of the national average, and among you, 45% had parents who were separated or divorced.
Now, to me, that's the fascinating part. That's another fascinating statistic because we are Christians. And so if there are difficulties in relationships, why can't we work them out? Why can't we figure out what's going on, get some help, and really bring about change in the system? Instead, parents would be willing to to separate or divorce. And I think that's fascinating, that number being that high in a Christian community.
Well, the next one, domestic violence, again, a little below the national average, okay? And then having a parent who's an addict, okay, we can see we're a little less than half or a little more than half the national average, or less than half the national average, 11.3 versus 26.8. And I would expect that because we have this thing about the health message and not being, temperance and not drinking or using drugs, those kinds of things. So you reported a much lower average than the national average.
But I would even challenge that because I think we have often been very narrow in our understanding of what an addiction is, and that is alcohol, drugs, sex. And most Adventists, a typical Adventist wouldn't say that, boy, I have an addiction to drugs or I have an addiction to alcohol. But man, we have addictions to shopping. We have addiction to food. We have addiction to people pleasing. And I don't think when we think of having a parent who has addictions, we would even include that.
Or addictions to our emotional states like anger or anxiety, those kind of things, which takes us into mental illness.
Yes.
40.9% of you shared that you had a family member who struggled with mental illness, compared to 16.6 in the national average. So you can see how much higher that is, almost 3 times as much, huh? And having a family member in prison, 8% in the national average compared to 18.1% of you had a family member that was in prison. And again, that means that they were not there with you or for you. They were away from you. And again, the damage that has on a child being raised in that environment, we can't overstate either. The next one now is this. Did you have a parent in your family who was dominant or controlling, in everything that you did? You didn't have a voice. And again, we don't have statistics for national average that we could find on that one, except for domestic violence. And again, that's not exactly what we were talking about here. But over half of you said, yes, you had a parent, either your mother or your father, who told you what to do, and that kind of thing in your family. Next one is spiritual abuse. Okay, were you beaten up, for example, with the Bible verses, or with the writings of Ellen White, and some kind of spiritual abuse? 58.8% said yes, you were to that, compared with, again, we're talking here about several studies ranging from findings of 24% to 62%, but you're right up there with the highest of the highest, okay, in terms of having a history of spiritual abuse. Let's talk about that one for a minute, because I think that dominance and control and spiritual abuse, those two tend many times to go together. So talk about your experiences of that, if you would, for a moment.
I would say anybody care to talk about that, where a parent would, exercise dominance and control over your decision making, and the spiritual abuse. I've heard stories ranging from parents making children read the Bible. One story I remember, years ago, a woman was beaten because she didn't sing in worship. She didn't feel like singing, and so she was beat in worship. This is a woman that showed up at one of our women's retreats. And how sad is that would be a cause for a whipping, and the whipping was such that she had wounds on her because she refused to sing in worship.
Anyone care to share or talk about it in general? And do you see that bled over into spiritual abuse as well, because it was done in a church context, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. That there was a real connection there between dominance and control, and the way you experienced God, if you will, being lived out in your family. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Anybody else?
Anna.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's so great to see you guys. I am thinking of how I was raised in a Pentecostal denomination. It's global, mainly South America, but it was Pentecostal, and the dress code was for girls to wear long dresses and not wear earrings or makeup, and that was very strict. But what I wanted to talk about that kind of goes into and intertwines between dominance, control, and spiritual abuse is that you were valued the more God used you, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
In the prophetic, if you manifested certain gifts a certain way, you were valued. And in that way, there was dominance and control in the church, and there was spiritual abuse, because there was this concept that you were more important if you were closer to God and used a certain way, and that it was evident to other people, meaning you were bearing your fruits, right? Like you were. And so that interpretation of what the church looks like and how it moves and how it uses its gifts and how it manifests, but only in the four walls of the church, was really confusing. Now that I'm older, I'm understanding that our life is one. The body of Christ is one. Ministry is really just my life. It's just how I move in the world. Mm-hmm. It's not just behind the pulpit, giving Sunday school class, it's a sphere. It's multi-dimensional, right? It's not just this one binary thing, right? So yeah. So I that's all. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Well, let's go on to see some other findings. Were you bullied in school? Okay. 47.7%. Again, we have various national averages ranging from 19 to 46. So bullying. Death of a family member. Look at this. 3% to 7% in the national average, but over a third of you experienced the death of a family member. Wow, huh? Experiencing war, famine, or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Again, just a little above, some of the national averages there at 11.3%. Being raised in an unsafe neighborhood. Again, 22.7 national average. Again, when you consider the inner city of United States, 38%. Pressure to perform. Now check this one out. Pressure to perform. In other words, your value, your lovability was connected to how you performed. 22% national average, but we're at 52%, huh? That pressure to perform. Control by government, okay. Again, this has to do with some people who were immigrants from other countries and they were in an unsafe country, but not many of you experienced that. But discrimination either because of your race, because of your gender, or your sexuality. Okay, so 38.3%, and you can see some of the national averages, we're right kind of in there. So again, this is the findings from the Breaking the Mold community. And it's something that's important for us to think about, something important for us to really wrestle with as we are on our own journey with God.
How do you feel about these findings?
Wow, thank you. Pressure to perform. You didn't get an A, you got a B. Yeah.
Anyone else that would like to speak about some of their initial thoughts on the numbers that were just shared with us? Feel free to use that raise hand feature. I would like to say so far, thank you so much. I know that we were going through a lot emotionally, but it's different actually seeing the numbers and seeing the various categories. And so things like pressure to perform or things like emotional abuse, and I think because there are some people that may not have gone through emotional abuse outside of our community as much. Sometimes there's words like, oh, just get over it or move on or, pray the pain away. And sometimes I just feel like, well, a lot of times I feel like it's a total neglect of someone's personhood, of someone's deep, dark hurts. And so I'm just very grateful for you sharing this with us because it helps us to know what we're focusing on and if we're even hitting the mark in terms of are we meeting the needs of people in our community? But Aunt Ruthie, I see your hand. So.
Good morning. Welcome, Dr. Sedlacek. So good to see you. I want to say that I'm overwhelmed by what I'm seeing because I always thought that the abuse, the neglect, those things were in the minority. I just thought that they were in the minority. I could never imagine that in a church community, they would be so high. Because we're talking, for the most part, I'm seeing 50%. Well, you're saying 1/3. You know what I'm saying? But maybe some of the very people that were telling me to go ahead were people who suffered this, or maybe they're so deeply in denial they don't even know what what happened to them was not normal. So I just I'm blown away by these results. I really am. Wow, it's amazing.
Cliff and then Joel.
After taking some time to just reflect on numbers, at first I thought that the numbers were alarming. And then I was like, well, it's not surprising. But then I also thought again, okay, so we're talking about the national average versus our BTM community. And I think it's it makes sense that it's higher, just because in comparison to the national average and how most people experience these kind of abuse and suppress them and misreport them, the BTM community offers a space where people can be vulnerable and share these things and just seek the healing to grow past these things. So when I see that the numbers are higher, it is alarming. But as we all know, when we're trying to heal or moving in a direction of healing, it's like sometimes you have to dig up those painful experiences in order to move past them. And I think that's what the data shows.
Well said. And then Joelle, and then Judy. All right. And then Judy, and then we'll go back to the Sedlaceks, okay? Judy, can you hear me? I think you're on mute, Judy.
What I'd like to share is from the standpoint of, I feel to a great extent that the church impacts the family. It's not just the family in singular, but I think that what we learn in church, we impute to our families. So that in church, there is a pressure to perform. I know for me, at the church where I was or am attending, once you perform, you have friends. And people, oh yes, sister, you are just wonderful, and etc. When you're not performing and you're a bench warmer per se, you don't have the attention, you don't have the friends. And from church, I think that is transferred over to one's family as well. Because I really feel to a great degree that we mirror our church beliefs and church experience. And so it's more the chicken before the egg kind of thing there.
I wish, Judy, that were true.
Pardon
Unfortunately,
me?
I said, I wish that were true. Unfortunately, it's not. I learned how to do relationship in my family. And I go into another community and I take all the skills or lack of skills into that community. And in that community, in fact, what we know is where you get more than 3 or 4 individuals together, you are automatically, unconsciously going to act, function the way you did in your family.
Oh.
And so it's just automatic. It's unconscious. It's not something you say, oh, I think I'm going to do this, but you automatically function that way. I think what is probably accurate in terms of the posture that you're presenting is that we are attracted to the church, to various kinds of churches for various reasons, and that's based on our family of origin issues. But the truth is that I take my dysfunction and I take it into the church community. And if I have a bunch of people who are raised in similar ways the way I was, then it is going to be a cultural norm. And oftentimes we say, well, I can't tell the difference between my family and my church. But the truth is, we take our dynamics from our family into a church setting. We take our abilities, what we've learned in the family, we take them on the job. We often, if you think about the kinds of jobs that you have, the kind of dynamics you find on your job, if you look carefully, you will see that they very much oftentimes mirror your family dynamics.
So I'd like to join that conversation for just a minute. As someone who was not raised Adventist, I know that when I came into the church, my whole world was turned upside down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are things that I had never been exposed to before that I had to decide whether to internalize or not. And so I think that there is an interplay between those two factors. The church and our belief system, I think, is very, very important in terms of shaping who we are. But we certainly bring our families into the church, there's no question. But I think there's a real interplay between the two that I think is important for us to understand as well.
That may be a more accurate picture, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Judy. And we'll toss it back over to the Sedlaceks.
Okay. I'm not quite sure why I am not. Can you advance that, Devonte?
No, he can't do it because he doesn't have it. We have
I
it.
wonder why.
I don't know. Plug it back in and see what happens. There you go.
Okay. So what is trauma? Okay. This is a very important thing for us to discuss. What is trauma? So
Yeah, a trauma is a traumatic or life-threatening event that is outside the normal range of daily human experience. We used to think that trauma had to be, some big event like 9/11 or school shooting. Those are traumatic experiences, but trauma can occur in even less dramatic ways. Watching my brother or my sibling get beat for nothing, for no reason, because my parent lost their cool or lost their temper. That's a traumatic experience for us. And so it's deeply distressing and it's definitely a disturbing experience. One of the experts in the field, Van der Kolk, says, and it's an event that overwhelms, and this is the important thing, it overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. Very, very important. I'm reading a book right now called The End of Memories. And the idea behind this theologian's premise is that we really don't recall memories very accurately and or truthfully. By the time memories do come up, depending upon the experience that happened and depending upon the emotional component of that experience, we may remember it very different than the way it actually occurred. And I love that idea because if I have been traumatized, the way I remember it right after it happened versus the way I remember it, 6 months after it happens, it may be very different. And there's some very interesting research about recall and trauma that I'm just now beginning to appreciate. And so the other point about what Van der Kolk and other experts are now understanding, and we really now have a greater understanding on, is how the body responds to a traumatic event. It's not just a story of something that happened back then, he says, it's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and feeling and fear living inside people. And I think that's very, very important to highlight.
did you know?
Yes.
Okay, now there are three realms of ACEs that I think we want to talk about next. And those realms are, you'll recognize them. You know, there are the household ones, and many of those were included in the ACE study, like divorce and a family member in prison, physical, emotional abuse or neglect, homelessness, alcohol, drugs, those kind of things, okay? But there are community ACEs as well, which is really important for us to understand. The neighborhood in which I live, or, you know, was that safe for me? Did I experience discrimination in my neighborhood? Did I have substandard housing, less access to jobs? You know, all of those kinds of things. And again, even historical trauma. Okay. So, you know, and so some of that is called, what is it called? Post-traumatic slave disorder?
Yeah, someone has a title that's entitled that,
Yeah.
post-traumatic slave
So
disorder.
something along those lines. But then there is also environmental trauma. And again, some of us can recognize that, of course, with the pandemic. That was kind of an environmental trauma that we all experienced.
Yes.
But natural disasters like tornadoes and hurricanes and volcanoes and earthquakes and then climate crisis, you know, record heats or droughts, wildfires, smoke, storms, floods, mudslides, sea level rise. I mean, you know, we know that a lot of people are thinking about environmental change. I mean, I'd like to get an electric vehicle now because of the environment and what's going on, so that I can do my little part in reducing greenhouse gases and so forth. But you can see the different realms of ACEs. So this broadens our definition of ACEs beyond, you know, what we tend to think in terms of church, school, or home. Okay. And then talk about this.
Yeah, the intergenerational.
Epigenetics.
Yes. Oh my goodness. This is so very important to understand. Last night we had the privilege of having dinner with several wonderful people, and what was fascinating about the dinner was that most of the people there had deep missionary roots, parents, grandparents who did a lot of missionary work, you know, overseas in Africa. One man who was there, his grandfather actually began the Seventh-day Adventist work in Kenya. And it was just fascinating to hear these people talking. And while they were talking, I was processing some of the stories that I've heard in terms of people of color and the generational pieces that were passed down to through the generations, a lot of sexual abuse, a lot of shaming that happened. And just there is a lot of trauma that gets passed down intergenerationally. And I think it's important to understand it. So here I am in this day and age, and I'm living my life. And all of a sudden I understand, because of the skeletons in the closet, I actually acted out the skeletons that nobody bothered to talk to me about. And I am actually living them, whereas my great-grandfather didn't talk about them. And my grandfather was exposed to living with a grandfather, a father who was traumatized, and how got passed down the PTSD, the alcoholism, the sexual abuse, and the emotional repression. That all gets passed down, whether we understand it or not. It does. And what happens, what we know today, again, because of the work around genes and the epigenetics is what it's called. The epigenetics means that a gene can express itself differently. It can be turned on or turned off. A part of the gene can be turned on and turned off based on environmental factors. And so that's one area, very informational and very helpful to understand while we're working with people. Survivors of slavery, for example. I can't even begin to tell you sometimes the stories that I've heard, or on Facebook, you hear people were. I just saw a clip about being raised with a Black mama, and things that were said. You better sit your behind down, and if you fall, I'm going to break your neck, and all of those things that we attribute and we laugh about how parents talk to their kids, or their great grandparents talk to them, and now they're passing it on to us. Or the shaming that happened, where kids are shamed publicly on Facebook and in other circumstances, and not understanding that that's a generational curse from our experience as slavery, not having an understanding of how relationships work. It really has its roots in how we were treated in terms of slaves, as slaves coming to whatever country we're in, whether you're in Jamaica, Haiti, or in America. And one other piece, since I understand epigenetics, you know how when God would tell the children of Israel, when you go into a land, you kill everybody, mother, father, children, you kill everybody. And people always have had a very difficult time with that. Wow, why would Jesus want children to be killed? What would be wrong with a kid living who had a great grandfather who was, for example, a slave owner? And I'm speaking specifically about that because we in America have never really owned up to the damage that slavery has done. And so our great grandparents who may have had slaves, or we may have come from a slave line, if in fact you have been exposed to that and your gene pool has, your epigenetic gene pool has been turned on or turned off, it's no wonder that now we're seeing all this anti-Semitism, and of course the racial, the racism that occurs. Well, it happened way back then, and we're seeing the fruit of that now. And so it's no small wonder that that trauma gets passed on, our abandonment, domestic violence. And what we need to do is, of course, work on our own trauma. So if you don't want to pass it on, you got to work on your own trauma. And then the next one, just the surviving famines and oppressions and all of that. It's no small wonder that people are struggling with depression when in fact they've had trauma that's been passed on through the generations, poverty, severe anxiety, and of course depression.
This is an interesting slide. It talks a little bit about Sabbath and Sabbath rest, giving your brain a break. Now, just take a look at the left brain here. Okay, this is the brain that's at work. People are in their cubicles and their heads are down and they're on their computers and they're doing whatever they got to do, and the stress that goes with that, pressure to work, get things done, but look at the right side of the brain. Okay, this is a side where people are looking at flowers, they're resting, reading a book, playing, seeing nature, butterflies and trees, and taking photographs and videos, and
Creative side.
It's the creative side of your brain. Okay, and I believe that God created Sabbath for us so that we could have that kind of an experience where we could really play and rest and give our brains a break from the constant do hurry, perform, get stuff done. We're subject to that so much. I mean, here in the seminary, we had what last week, Devonte? We had final exams, right? Papers due, a test to take, all of that kind of pressure. Sabbath is meant to be a time when we can let our brains rest, our bodies rest, and really experience intimacy and connection with God, the spiritual part of ourselves that he designed for us to have all the time, that intimacy.
I look at this slide entirely different. I look at this slide in terms of my left brain, it's my cognitive thinking, how I process material in a very linear, logical way. And then the right side of my brain, which is very creative. And that bridge that we see on the slide, there really is a bridge where they are supposed to work together. And when that doesn't happen as a result of trauma, by the way, if in my experience, if the trauma was such that my feelings were so overwhelming and nobody helped me to process my feelings, I get stuck in my cognitive processing and how I see life. And I ask people, well, how do you feel? And they'll give me a thought. Or they'll tell me, I have to think about how I feel. Well, you don't think about how you feel, you just feel. And you get stuck on that left side of your brain. Whereas on the right side, I see this is the creative part that God intended for us to be in touch with. And I also see it as the emotional side. This is where our memories get processed and channeled and ultimately stored in a coherent fashion. And they're supposed to work together. And when that doesn't happen as a result of trauma, we then are left with being stuck either on one side of the brain or on the other side of the brain. And as David is suggesting, they are supposed to work together. And so how I see this slide would be a Sabbath rest. The real Sabbath rest would be to have God really bring about the healing that I recognize that my left side is really working too hard, and maybe my right side is really more in charge. My emotional brain, I lose control, I get angry very easily, and God wants these two parts to work together.
Yes, 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 yes. Well, resilience is something that is very, very important to understand for the healing of trauma. And again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on resilience, but it's the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, sources of stress, such as family relationship problems, health problems, workplace financial stressors, all of those things which we tend to face, by the way, especially during holiday time, I might say. But how do I adapt in the face of all of these things? It's interesting to note that trauma research says that 20% of the people who experience trauma respond resiliently. In other words, it does not create post-traumatic stress disorder in their lives. They're able to rise above it. They're able to cope with it. They're able to not let it negatively affect their lives the way it affects the lives of the majority of people. So resilience is important, and building resilience is, we're going to be talking a little bit about how that happens, how resilience is built. And again, I want to say this right now. We're not going to finish this today. I can tell right now. So you may have to invite us back.
Whoa,
You just may have to invite us back, But anyway,
yeah.
Resilience is something to keep at the forefront of our minds, because that's the goal, is building resilience in order to, because listen, is trauma always going to be in our lives? Is there someone who's close to you who's going to die at some point? Are things going to be getting financially better in our country? This divide that we experience here right now, the political divide, the spiritual divide, it's not going to get a whole lot better. And so now's the time to face our trauma, process it, build resilience so that the things that come into the future, we're going to be able to handle without them taking us out. Okay? Isn't that the goal?
But before we move on, and we do want to leave you with some bit of good news, but I do want to say that resilience happens. Resilience is supposed to be built in based on our interactions and our relationship with our parents. So those first 7 years of life are pretty important. Our parents teach us we have these big feelings. I fall down and I skin my knee and it feels like the world is coming to an end. And my mother or my father come alongside me and help me to process, yes, this hurts, this is really painful, and I'm so sorry it happens to you. And it helped me to contain my big feelings. That's part of attachment. That's part of connecting with me. And that means that they see me. And in seeing me, I am soothed and I learn how to manage my big feelings. My brother comes in my room and he breaks my favorite doll. And I just lose my mind. I am totally out of it. And I want to pummel my big brother. My parents coming alongside me and helping me. Hey, I see you. I'm so sorry that happened. I'm so sorry your brother did not respect your boundaries, and help you to manage those big feelings and help you to learn how to respond appropriately. That's what a parent is supposed to do. And so for many of us, the message is, suck it up. You don't really have anything to cry about. I'll give you something to cry about. How many of you all have heard that? I'll give you something to cry about. And so you don't have a means to even understand these big feelings we have. We call that the window of tolerance. I can manage my feelings. I can respond in an appropriate, socially appropriate manner. I'm not going to lose control. And everybody has a window of tolerance. But when we have a lot of trauma in our lives and we go into this hypervigilant state, always looking for things to happen, that window of tolerance gets smaller, gets more narrow, and it doesn't take much to flip us out of that ability to function. And when we get outside of our window of tolerance, we need someone to help us to manage those feelings, those big feelings, and to bring ourselves back into that window of tolerance. We need community. And you know how we feel about this particular community and what Devonte has cultivated here and the work that you all have done here. This is community. You need it to somebody to hear you. We all need to be seen, and in being seen, we can feel safe, secure, and we really can function in a way. What is seen? Soothed, safe, and secure. And so we need all four of those parts to have really be resilient, as it were.
And when that happens, our window of tolerance then gets broadened.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Which means we're more resilient. We can handle more stress during that time when our window of tolerance is broader.
Yes.
So that's the goal of community.
Yes.
Now, in that context, I want to talk about prayer. Now, please understand, I'm not just talking about, I have this duty of praying every single day as a part of my spiritual life, and so I got to get in my 15 minutes. That's prayer as doing. I'm talking about prayer as being, prayer as a relationship between myself and God. And I might bring other people. Remember, there's corporate prayer as well, where we come together as a community to pray together, and so when we take time, and I'm talking about here just time to get out of the doing, get out of the, and just be with God, listen to God, open our hearts to God, lament before God about our lives and what's happened, and learn to listen to God, to see his voice at work, to see his power at work in our lives, leading us and guiding us. I mean, Beverly and I have so many experiences over the course of our lives together where God has taken us and led us from place to place. And sometimes he took us to places where that wasn't our preference. I can remember when we were down at Oakwood, and God said to come up here. I'm not going up to the cold. That's not what our preference would have been. But God directed us up here and for his purposes. And it's been so wonderful and so powerful. But this intimacy, I may have shared with you that, a few months ago, I was sitting in the morning waiting for Sabbath school to start. And I experienced this surge of energy coming into my heart. And I heard God say to me, David, don't you know how much I love you? Oh my goodness, that was so powerful for me. And I believe so much needed for me at that point. Don't you know how much I love you? That was intimacy that I had developed with God, where I could hear his voice. I needed to hear his voice. So I'm talking about prayer as intimacy, connection with God, not just so many minutes that's a part of a duty.
Yeah, I want to read this to you, and I want you to listen very carefully. A part of you was left behind very early in your life as a result of trauma. That's my ad. The part that never felt completely received. It is full of fears. Meanwhile, you grew up with many survival skills, but you want yourself to be one. So you have to bring home the part of you that was left behind. Listen carefully. That is not easy, because you have become quite a formidable person, and your fearful part does not know if it can safely dwell with you. Your grown-up self has to become very childlike, hospitable, gentle, and caring, so your anxious self can return and feel safe. You complain that it is hard for you to pray, to experience the love of Jesus, but Jesus dwells in your fearful, never fully received self. When you befriend your true self and discover that it is good and beautiful, you will see Jesus there. Where you are most human, most yourself, weakest, there Jesus lives. Bringing your fearful self home is bringing Jesus home. As long as your vulnerable self does not feel welcomed by you, it feels so distant that it cannot show you its true beauty, and it keeps so distant that it cannot show you its true beauty and wisdom. Thus, you survive without really living. Try to keep your small, fearful self close to you. Try to keep it close to you. This is going to be a struggle, because you have to live for a while with the not yet. Your deepest, truest self is not yet home. It quickly gets scared. Since your intimate self does not feel safe with you, it continues to look for others, especially those who offer it some real, though temporary, consolation. But when you become more childlike, it will no longer feel the need to dwell elsewhere. It will begin to look to you as home. Be patient. When you feel lonely, stay with your loneliness. Avoid the temptation to let your fearful self run off. Let it teach you its wisdom. Let it tell you that you can live instead of just surviving. Gradually, you will become one, and you will find that Jesus is living in your heart and offering you all you need. Now, that's a lot. That's a lot. And I will certainly be happy to pass that on to Devonte and company, so you can read that again and just kind of chew over that. But that's what trauma has done to us. It's caused us to leave parts of ourselves behind. And God is interested in us understanding that where we have left ourselves, that's where we're going to find him, because that's where he is. He's there tending to that broken part of us. And that it is just such a comforting thing to me to know that, and I can see it in my own life, how I have dismissed myself. I didn't want to connect with that broken part of me, but that's where I'm going to find Jesus. And so I can't stress that enough. He is wanting so much for us to really know that he is right there with us, always has been. He will never leave us. I had someone ask me just yesterday, I want to know why this happens. Why questions is really not the answer, because that's really a head thing. But it's really understanding that it's easy to dismiss myself. God says, no, I don't want you to do that anymore. I want you to welcome every part of yourself back home.
And we tend to beat ourselves up with shame so easily. We've heard messages like, why did you do that? What's wrong with you? But what trauma asks is a different question. And that is, what happened to you? What happened to you? Not why did you do that with judgment, but what happened in your life that would lead you to do this or that, or to be this or that, or not be this or that? What happened? So it begins dialogue, conversations with our innermost self, instead of going to shame and fear because we felt or been condemned. So I'd like to take our last few minutes to just open it up for dialogue, questions. Devonte, what do you think? Take us where you need to go.
Yes. I just want to, wow, there's so much there, but I just love what you just said right there. What trauma asks is, what happened to you? Right. And from Doc Bev, does your vulnerable self feel safe with you? That was powerful. So I just wanted to say that. But yeah, we will take a couple of minutes. Does anybody have any thoughts from the presentation that we just heard from the Sedlaceks? I'm going to stop